Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 or part 3 for some of you of our conversation on Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. I'm Sheila Davis and I am the moderator for this afternoon. I'm joined by Susan Kaplan, who's in the reception hall, as well as Debbie Zucker and Judy Houston will help me facilitate. So you are probably wondering why the NAACP Religious Affairs Committee continues to have a discussion about Heather McGee's book. And I'll tell you why. I feel as if this country is moving away from our democratic ideals and toward authoritarianism. It is not enough to show up and vote, as important as that is. I started feeling this way after the Sandy Hook shooting when 6-year-olds were slaughtered at a school. And very little happened by the way of common sense gun reform. Then Donald Trump was elected president and we saw further erosion of our democratic ideals. Now we have President Joseph Biden as our president and Kamala Harris as our vice president, which is progress. But then when I consider what has been happening in Tennessee with the massacre of 9-year-olds at a Christian school and adult staff, and I see Black Tennessee legislators, the Justins as I call them, Justin Pearson and Justin Jones, demanding sensible gun reform, and they're expelled from the supermajority, they've been reinstated, against a backdrop in the South of college boards stripping down its AP curriculum of African American studies, don't say gay laws, the banning of books, restriction of reproductive rights. I feel as if this moment requires the civil rights playbook that Martin Luther King, Congressman John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, and the great Diana Tash used. And I believe that that playbook is embedded in the Sum of Us. And that is the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Framework. This afternoon, you will be introduced to that framework. So here is how our time together will flow. I'm a teacher at heart, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. We have clergy in the room, we have people who've been doing this work for decades, we have people who never read the book, we're new to this conversation. So in order to bring everyone up to speed, we're going to start with the podcast, which summarizes the Sum of Us book. For the next 20 minutes, I'm going to ask you to listen. Then we're going to move into the food hall, where you will eat and discuss the podcast. And in particular, I'd like you to consider what moved you about the podcast and what questions you might have. So then we're going to return to the sanctuary and share what we discussed. And then we will explore the foundations of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Framework. Any questions so far?
I have an update. We had talked about receiving food, so we have appetizers, and so just in terms of how many people we are and taking what you need, please be efficient in that regard. Yeah, they're appetizers, and hope that that sustains you for the book.
Thank you, Susan. So now we're going to, and I also want to welcome the people online. We have people. Thank you. Now we're going to listen to the podcast, which summarizes the book, The Sum of Us. We ready to?
A note, this episode contains a reference to suicide. Please take care while listening.
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, which is an all-Black community. All of my neighbors and friends, my classmates in school, they were all Black. And we didn't have an opportunity, or we didn't interact with people of different races. It just wasn't done.
When Gail Christopher was 14 in 1964, she won a scholarship to go to an arts camp in Chautauqua, New York, not too far from Niagara Falls.
It was my first time away from home and my first time in basically an all-white community. So it was an adjustment. So you can imagine going off to this encampment into this community that was all white, with the exception of some of the wait staff and housekeepers, and one other African-American student was on the campus. Other than that, this was my immersion experience in white America.
Gail had a roommate who was white, and she was from the other side of Cleveland, the west side.
We were roommates, and we had the top room in our little Victorian house, and we had bunk beds, and we became friends. We just got to know each other, and I talked about my family, and she talked about her family. I learned, for instance, that she was an only child and that her father was a Cleveland police officer. She learned that I had siblings, and my father was a truck driver. And we just shared. We shared meals together. We walked to and from the major venues and centers and just got to know each other very well. And then before I knew it, the summer was over. It was time to go home.
But right before she was to leave Chautauqua, Gail experienced something that would fundamentally change how she saw the world.
I was walking down the street heading toward our little Victorian home, and it was yellow. I'll never forget it. And I saw an ambulance in front of our house. And so I picked up my pace. I ran to the front porch, and our house parents were on the front porch, and they were carrying my roommate out on a stretcher. She was clearly unconscious. I asked the house parents, "What happened? What's going on?" And they told me that she had attempted suicide. And they were taking her to the hospital. And so I ran upstairs to our room we had shared for some reason. That was my impulse. And there on her bed, the lower bunk, she had left a note for me. And the note said, I'm kind of choking up as I tell this story, but the note said, "Dear Gail, I've come to know you and think of you as a dear friend, but my father has taught me to hate Black people. And I don't want to live that way anymore." I'll never know if they revived her. I never saw her again. There was no more conversation, but I know that's what she put in the letter to me. The idea of going home to that way of thinking and living was too much for her to cope with. Believing what her father had taught her, which was to hate people like me. You know, hate was a very strong word in the mind of a child. And I felt it when I remember feeling that when I read that note. And I remember feeling so sorry for her. My primary response was to wish that she didn't have to live with that kind of confusion and pain.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
I am Gail Christopher, Executive Director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity, former Senior Advisor and Vice President to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Chair of the Board of the Trust for America's Health, and mother of Heather McGee.
From Higher Ground and Futuro Studios, I'm your host, Heather McGee. And this is The Sum of Us, a podcast documenting my journey around the United States in search of hope and solidarity.
Yes, it is.
Who's there?
Look.
Who is it? I want to see. You gotta tell me.
It's Nana.
Nana! Oh. Hi, Mom. It took us so much longer. Hi, Bob. It was Nana. Are you okay?
What happened? Oh, there's a little bit of blood.
No, it's not blood. It's just a strawberry. No. After all my trips to different cities and small towns for this podcast, my last trip was to Fort Washington, Maryland. I brought my 3-year-old son and drove down to see Dr. Gail Christopher, aka Nana.
Did you see the pretty flowers?
They're beautiful. Did you just get those just now? Oh, Mom. You are so funny. Oh, look at the fig tree. It's doing great. Came back from the dead. I came to see my mom because she's the person who helps me make sense of the world. And I needed to make sense of this journey I just finished, traveling across the country to find stories of solidarity dividends, what we can win in communities when we come together across race and difference. I knew that my mom would help me better understand what I learned in the moment we're in now, because for the past nearly 50 years, her work has revolved around improving public policy for families. And in recent years, she's focused almost exclusively on the need for healing from racism. It's her voice that's often in my head as I see examples of racism's far-reaching costs in our society. But when I began describing the people I'd met and the victories they'd won, it took her mind back to this story from her childhood about summer camp. So to me, Mom, when I first heard you tell this story, it felt like this was the moment that the seed of the emotional need for you to create spaces for racial healing was planted, where you knew that racism cuts, it destroys, it can kill, and that we all need to be healed from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mom, did you,
Yeah.
what did you think about white people before Chautauqua, before this immersion experience?
Well, I don't think I did a lot of conscious thinking about white people. Certainly not white kids.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was fully on a path to live your same childhood, right? Because not much had changed from the east side of Cleveland to the south side of Chicago a generation later. The neighborhood I was born in was, almost 100% Black in Chatham, Avalon. But then I went to boarding school. And that decision, which now that I have a child, I have to say is very difficult to imagine, an 11-year-old going 10 states away to what was an virtually all-white boarding school in Western Massachusetts when I was 11. What was going on in your mind when you did that, when you made that decision?
I was a divorced single parent, as you know, and you were a very gifted child. And initially, you came to me and said, Mom, can I go to boarding school?
I love this version of the story where this was my idea.
It's the absolute truth.
Because you didn't send me away. I requested it.
Well, and anyone who knows you knows that's quite possible, as you tend to be the driver. But so I think on some level it may have taken me back to my Chautauqua experience, which up until the end and the trauma of, for all I knew, losing this friendship and this roommate, up until that point, that experience had actually been life-changing in a pretty positive way for me. It was art and it was music and it was people and it was conversation. It was reading. It was just fun. But I was also thinking of the risks that you faced as a young Black girl in Chicago, with me having to work 3 jobs in order to support us. And it seemed like an environment where you were protected 24/7 made sense.
And it was incontrovertibly one of the best things that ever happened to me. I went from being sort of understimulated at school and just bored to being really enriched and engaged. So it was a lot of what you remember about Chautauqua, being in this idyllic, peaceful setting. And in terms of what it added to my life by way of getting to know and to love these other people, these other girls who were 11, 12, 13 years old, living together in a house, we really ended up turning to each other to become each other's family during those sort of tender adolescent years. So, the person I spoke to as I was going to sleep every night was a Puerto Rican girl from Queens, from Jackson Heights.
Oh, yeah, Ida.
And, who I was brushing my teeth with every morning was a girl from Hong Kong, and who I shared my great love of female-driven fantasy novels was a blonde girl who lived in the next town over. And so it just, in a very similar to you in that season at Chautauqua, when you were sort of young enough not to have believed that we are so different and that there's this unbridgeable divide between us because of the color of our skin and our origin, I learned to love people from different races and see them love me and connect on these parts of our humanity that were just more important than all that divided us.
What you're saying is so validated and documented by the limit.
So I encourage you to finish listening to the podcast. That the entire series is incredible. But that gives you a taste of the book. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into the dining hall, get some food, and I'd like you to sit at a table and talk to other people at your table about what moved you about the podcast and what questions that you might have. We're going to do that for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to return to the sanctuary. Any questions? Yes. No, any table that you want to sit at is fine. No assignment at this point.
What do you want the online people to do? Do they know what they're doing now?
They can just.
They already know what they're gonna do.
Okay.
Yeah, we're actually going to put you on mute now. So if somebody can.
Online, is there anyone online?
There we go. We can hear you now.
Okay. Would anyone like to share what they discussed in our break? Please come on. Please come on.
And if you talk, put it right up to your mouth. It's a close mic.
Yes, I want to. I think we talked about there wasn't much to talk about. There was one story of the Chautauqua.
Speak up a little bit.
Neil, okay. Neil's gonna turn the volume up.
We talked about the story of the girl who committed suicide or attempted to suicide. And the idea there being that racism hurts everybody. That's all I said.
Yes, thank you. Any other comments?
We wondered how it could be that racism could make a parent teach a child to hate. And we also then questions we had was, how can we get in touch with people of color so we can talk about this?
There's a hand in the back.
In our table, we discussed how our endemic zero sum system is partly or to a great deal culpable with racism in this country. Since the very beginning, you have some that feel that if others gain, I lose. Also, the idea of who is a racist. And there, I think someone mentioned that they felt that racism was endemic. Everybody is a racist. Someone else said, no, I don't think that that's true. And my personal feeling is that, yes, I think we all inherently, because of the society in which we have been raised, we are racist of different kinds. We use the example of someone that would say, oh, I am not a racist. I would take the shirt off my back to give it to a Hispanic person, a person, and that person means that absolutely not racist. That is a racist remark. Those are racist feelings. The fact that I feel that, you know, in order for a person of the minority group to have a shirt on their back, it is up to me to say them and give it to them. A non-racist society would see to it that that person has the ability to get their own shirts.
Any other comments? Okay, oh, we have it over here.
Also online, is there any?
No, I can't, last look at that.
So along those same lines, our group talked about cultural appropriation, and there was a dialogue about is it a bad thing to borrow or to get an idea from communities of color about things that they use in their culture and then adopt that? Isn't that honoring it? And another point of view is, yeah, but a lot of people in the communities of color don't feel that way. And therefore, we have to listen and open our ears and understand that our white culture perspective may limit us from being able to understand what we're hearing. It might sound not as rational as we think we are, but it is. So.
Any comments from people online? I don't see you, so I'm not sure.
We're asking.
Okay.
It looks like Robert just unmuted.
Go ahead, Robert.
I did that accidentally, but I'd be glad to mention something. And that's that it's kind of like making phone calls because you sit down on your phone and then all of a sudden you call people. The thing that drew me to come here and still is what really echoes around inside me is kind of the question maybe that we're going to be dealing with a little bit later, which is the how do we move against the situation where we are. And what touched me about the book was that there are lots of examples of people who actually achieve some of that. And some of the important ways that they do that is at least the way my take it is to not focus on who exactly is a racist or whether they're a worse racist than other people, but to find things that you can do together with people and work on real projects that different groups want. And it's the informal contact between people of different races, but I'd also include people of different worldviews. I mean, there are people that vote for policies that continue the inequitable distribution of wealth. And they don't do it because they sit down and say, well, you know, I'd really like to increase the difference between minority groups' wealth and mine. They sit down because they view the world differently. They view themselves as the people that are being threatened. And it's a fear response. So there's a set numbers of levels of kind of psychological work we have to do in understanding who we're talking to, but also an understanding that it's only by putting aside many of those differences, at least temporarily, and working on something real, do we get somewhere. So that's my accidental contribution.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. Any other before we move on, because we have a time is ticking. Okay. So Neil, if you could pull up the PowerPoint, I want to introduce the Truth in Racial Healing and Transformation Framework. So I think it should be slide 3.
Hang on. Put this out of the way. Okay.
Okay. So this is slide 23 on your handout. So the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Framework is actually based on the Truth and Reconciliation process that was used in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And reading from the slide, this was something that was launched by the Kellogg Foundation and Gail Christopher, whom you heard earlier, as a comprehensive national and community-based process to plan for and bring about transformational and sustainable change and to address the historic and contemporary effects of racism in the United States. Now, there are 14 groups across the country, and I think it's actually more now, that are receiving funds from the Kellogg Foundation to do this work. And they have come up with an implementation guidebook on how do you actually implement this in various settings and circumstances. And so we're going to look at the questions that frame the framework. And if you can go to the next slide. So the questions, there's 5 questions. One is, what will our community look and feel like after racism has ended? 2, what are the current racial realities of our community and how did we get there? 3, what are the key leverage points of change in our community? 4, who are the key stakeholders and beneficiaries not at the table? How can they be engaged? We talked a little about that in our informal group. And then 5, what specific actions can be taken to achieve our vision of a community without racism? So those are the visioning questions for this framework. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide up again into groups according to the number on your name tag. We should have 4 groups. 3 groups will be in this room, and then a 4th group is going to be in one of the classrooms. I'm going to lead a group, Susan's going to lead a group, Debbie's going to lead a group, and Judy's going to lead a group. And within your group, you will choose one of these 5 questions, and you'll have about 30 to 40 minutes to talk amongst yourselves about your question. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about what you discussed. But before we actually do this, and the online people are going to do the same thing, we are going to use the Courageous Conversations About Race protocol to have this discussion. And the reason is because conversations about race in heterogeneous groups can be very difficult. That's been my experience. And I've experienced, as an African-American woman, I've experienced erasure when I'm in these conversations in white dominant spaces. I experienced the need to solve racism within, I don't know, the course of 30 minutes or something. We know that this is, part of the fabric of this country, has been going on for centuries. I've experienced discomfort, certainly. There's this assumption that there's only one truth. And so I'm going to ask Susan to talk about some of her experiences having these conversations. And then we're going to look at the protocol that we're going to use to have a conversation.
Would you be willing to give an example of erasure? What that looked like?
Well, I mean, it's just not, well, for instance, a conversation about race that becomes a conversation about socioeconomics or something else, because having a conversation about race is so difficult, is an example. Yeah, is something that comes to mind.
For me, it's that sense of, how many of you have done a lot of reading in the last couple of years? Raise your hands. How many of you read news, like New York Times, or how many of you listen to the radio, CPR or Democracy Now? So for me, I notice a tendency in me as a white person to go right to the news article or the book I've read. And then the person of color next to me is talking about a personal experience. And so it can become very intellectual. So that sense of me coming back to what's my personal experience. And if I don't have a personal experience, then I can talk about why I don't have a personal experience. But it's my lived experience. And we're going to be talking about the model. I might refer to an article, but that's different than centering it. Another is that sense of multiple perspectives. So we kind of just heard that now, right? Some differences at tables, talking, and that sense of how do we stay with race and not get caught in, oh, but I am from a working class family, so I can talk about that, and then pretty soon we're just down the road and we're not talking about race. It's so easy for me as a white person to get distracted, essentially, right? Or to talk about what feels more comfortable.
Another example of that comes to mind, I don't know if you remember the presidential debates. This was up to the 2020 election, and there were, I don't know, 14 Democratic candidates at the time. And there was a question at one of the debates about busing. And President Biden, who wasn't the president at the time, talked about, he was senator when, the experiment with busing started, and the data that came out of the Department of Education was grim and busing was a failure. And Kamala Harris replied, well, I'm a product of busing. I was bused out of Oakland into a more affluent school district, and I wouldn't be here if it had been for busing. And it just changed my life course. And so they were both coming from very different places. I mean, Biden was coming from this statistics, looking at the data place, a more rational, well, I don't want to say rational, but it was a very data-driven, he hadn't had any lived experience with busing. And she was coming from an experiential place. I mean, this is a lived experience for her. So both, both of their experiences were valid. But it was important to name where they were coming from in that conversation, which didn't happen during the debate.
So I think just one other aspect about isolating race is that I'm really a good person. I don't know if you know that about me. I'm a really good person. And I'm Jewish, and I believe in tzedakah and changing the world, and tikkun olam, and so that also distracts us from talking about race, because I really am a good person. I mean, how many people here are good people, or good saviors, or a good Jew, or a good Muslim, and so also paying attention to that, so we come back to talking about race. not centering on how good I am.
Great. So I'm gonna review the protocol that we're gonna use. And I realize that you're all new, many of you are doing this. I know some of you have been all trained in the protocol, and that's great. But I'd like to review the protocol that we will use to have this conversation. Okay. So number one is to stay engaged. All right. Number two is to expect to experience discomfort.
Slide 4. In your handouts, number 4.
Number three is to speak your truth. And number four is to expect and accept non-closure. Those are the 4 agreements. Then slide 6 in your handout, there are 6 conditions. We're going to focus on the personal, local, and immediate. So I'm going to avoid quoting meta-analyses and things that I might have read, but I'm going to focus on my experience. We're going to isolate race. We're going to normalize social construction in multiple perspectives. We're going to monitor our agreements, the conditions and established parameters. We're going to use a working definition of race, which I will present in a second. And we're going to examine the presence and the role of whiteness, which I'm going to explain too in about a minute. And then on slide 7, there's a compass. And this was created to help us understand how we each process and engage with information about race. It's a way to understand one another's opinions and beliefs. And this compass, there are 4 quadrants. There is the feeling quadrant, there's the thinking quadrant, there's the your belief system quadrant, and there's the action quadrant. So one of the questions with the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation framework is, what would Boulder County look like if racism no longer existed? And so if I were to begin that conversation, I would say something like, or what will this community look like and feel like after racism has ended? So for instance, I might say, as an African-American woman, and I'm coming from my thinking and feeling space, that that children that graduate from Boulder Valley School District are, thriving individuals and haven't experienced any racial trauma as a result of coming through the school system, which is currently not the case, unfortunately, as some of you know. So that would be how I would respond to that question. So I may be where I'm coming from, using the compass, I'm identifying who I am, and then I might say, and this is based on my, lived experience with my African-American friends who have who have children in the school system, and what they've suffered. So that is how I would enter that conversation, just to give you an example. I hope that makes sense. Yes. So for instance, I'm going to go back to the Biden-Kamala Harris example. I mean, Biden's perspective was, well, I've studied the Department of Education data and I've seen the studies and busing's a failure. That's his perspective. Kamala Harris says, well, I did it and it, contributed to my professional success. Both of those are perspectives and neither is wrong, but we have that conversation with both of those perspectives. That's what I mean by that perspective. I'm going to go to this. I would like to go to the slides where I talk about how we define race and how we define whiteness.
Can I ask you to repeat the question for those of us online? We could hear you, Sheila, but we can't hear the questions.
Oh, that's right. So the question was about the sixth condition, the third condition. Which is about social construction in multiple perspectives. That was her question. She had a question about that.
Thank you.
Okay. So the definition of race that I'm using is that race is a social construct. Excuse me. That it is something that has no objective reality, but rather is what people decide it is. And that race has no real existence other than what people and how people think of it. What matters then are the ideas we have attached to race. So that's what I'm talking about is social construction. Okay, there's no objective reality in race. Okay. And then this is how the Smithsonian defines whiteness. Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal.
Can you go back? I want to take a picture of whiteness. I've never seen that. Thank you.
We actually have the handout. We have it as a handout. Do we? Don't we?
Yeah, during the break, all of these slides will be posted to the resources folder, and it will be on the Zoom, and it's in all of your emails. It says resources. That will be up there. Okay.
And I think we have a few handouts as well for those of you who want them on that. Any other questions?
You want the third slide?
No, we're fine. Okay, so now we are going to divide into our groups. If you're a one, let's see. Let's say the ones are going to gather in this corner. Okay.
Some of us don't have numbers.
Oh, really?
Oh, so come up here, right afterwards and I'll help, sorry.
Okay. The ones are going to be over here. The twos are going to be over there. The threes are going to be in a classroom, which is beyond the foyer. Debbie is going to take the threes, and I hope she knows where to guide them. Yes, past the kitchen, okay. And the fours are going to gather up here, and Judy is going to facilitate the conversation with the fours. The ones are over here. I will be facilitating that conversation. The twos, Susan is going to facilitate that conversation. The threes, Debbie is going to facilitate, and the fours are up here with Judy.
And the remote people.
And the remote people,
They're gonna go back to the breakout.
They're gonna go back.
Yeah.
To break.
We're going to go breakouts, but can I have Sheila or Susan verify how much time we're going to have in the breakouts, just to clarify?
so we're at 6 o'clock. So we're going to have 25 minutes. It's going to be a short.
Yep.
So I realize that this is Sunday evening and you all have other places to go, and we're over 6:30. So I wanted to talk about our next steps. So, you know, I've had many conversations about race and racial healing, and I feel like they, you know, during the space of the conversation, incredible ideas are generated and then the energy dissipates. And we don't want that to happen. And so, and we have this framework. And we have people across the country that are doing this work. And so the Religious Affairs Committee of the NAACP is going to, I'm gonna say, sort of kickstart a committee that is gonna look at this truth and racial healing and transformation framework. And so we invite any of you who might be interested in doing a deeper dive around this framework to sign up. Judy is going to pass out clipboards so you can sign up. The other next step is you are welcome to join the NAACP, and I believe that we have the brochures in the lobby. So if you want to sign up online, we welcome you to do that as well. I would love to hear one-on-one, because I realize that our time is limited. You know, what are your thoughts about next steps? But we really want to engage with this framework, and we're organizing around that. I'm going to turn it over to Neil now. And I'm sorry, Susan, please go ahead.
Yeah, is also for online. Is there anyone online that also wants to sign up? So
Yeah, we are, we're having people send it to us in the chat. So if you're online, you can send it to us in the chat and we'll compile it and make sure that it gets to Sheila and Susan.
awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Any closing words? I wanted to have a report out on what we discussed, because I know our group had some we had a great conversation. We don't have much time, but if anybody wants to just stand up quickly and say something,
Come up front.
they have to come up front. That's more time though.
Speak up. Just speak up.
Just speak up.
Take it with the race.
Okay.
They won't be.
I just wanted to offer the vision that my group had of what Boulder County would look like if we ended racism. It would be a space where collective healing happens, healing spaces where we can heal ourselves and join together, have conversations, find innovative solutions to social issues, shift organizational culture, social culture, and other places so that we can all have the equal chance to prosper and thrive. And that we will benefit from one another. And this whole concept around culture add, that by having more cultures in our neighborhoods, around our tables, we are more innovative, we are more sustainable, and we are more compassionate than what many of us grew up in as a culture of fit, trying to find more people who look like us to have conversations with. And so thank you, Dr. Sheila. Our group talked about in the back, just taking some of these conversations and this framework to our neighborhoods, to our kitchen tables, and to meals that we share over the next few weeks too.
Thank you. Great. Closing words. Okay, I'm gonna, do you have anything else?
Well, just those of you that were facilitating, if we can just meet quickly before you head back to where you need to go.
Great. Neil, come on up.
Thank you. It was so wonderful. We are represented here by, I think, 18 faith and ethical communities. In Jewish tradition, there's different ways to write numbers. 18 high, alive is one of the ways of doing that. A nice thing to do. There's lots of food left, so don't rush out the door. We're here to chat and schmooze and eat. I was going to mention that there are 66 campuses across the nation that have started initiatives with the truth, racial healing, and transformation. Can anyone conjecture how many of those are in Colorado? Zero. Wouldn't it be nice if in Colorado we can have that happen here too? Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you to our moderators and our facilitators, and have a wonderful